My name is Subhadra and I am the curator of the science collections here at UCL. I've been working in the museum sector for getting on for about 12 years now. I originally trained as an archaeologist, so it's always been about the old stuff. Bricks and Mortals is a project that I put together because I wanted to find a way of telling a story that hasn't really been told in the public sphere. And that is the story of how UCL is the place where eugenics was invented. It's the place where eugenics as a science was legitimated. And I'm the curator of the Galton collection, which is one of the science collections at UCL, and there is no space for the permanent display of those objects. So we've got a lot of museum spaces at UCL, managed by the department I work for, UCL Culture, and there's room for all of those objects to be displayed, but not for the Galton collection. At the same time, there were conversations happening to do with student movements at UCL, like Why is My Curriculum White, and also a programme run by Nathaniel Coleman and Debbie Chalice, formerly at the Petrie Museum, which was called UCL Faces Race. And in the context of those discussions was the idea about building names. So there was a student at the seminar, Why Isn't My Professor Black? And he asked the question, quite legitimately I think, why do we have spaces at UCL that are named after people that hated us? Which I'm sure you will agree, very powerful question. And I wanted to find a way to address this question. For me, the point of having a museum collection on museum objects is those objects testify to a particular history, and I wanted to find a way to bring that history out. So I was combining this challenge of not having a permanent display space or museum space with the fact that we've got these buildings named after these people. And that was where the idea of the walking tour and the building tour came from. So what I did with the exhibition was turn the buildings of the UCL campus into objects in a museum. So the whole campus becomes a museum. And what people can do is they can walk around the campus and learn bits of the story as they're going along. So if they download the podcast, which they can find on the UCL Culture website, they can find the whole of that story. I think the most important thing a university can do is be honest about its past. I think that there are troubling and problematic histories within any academic institution. UCL is certainly not alone in having this history to do with race science. Race science was very much a thing that became a thing through university study. So for me, honesty is the most important thing. Because it's such a universal aspect of education in the West, this idea that these things did not happen here or we don't do these things anymore, the fact that that story isn't told to those of us who are people of colour within a predominantly white institution, the lack of that story is the thing that we find alienating. So it's not about us judging the past according to the standards of the modern day, it's about us wanting to be able to talk about this in an open and honest way. So really the biggest responsibility is about honesty. I really like the idea of thinking beyond breaking down the existing structures within the university to be able to further social justice. For me, it's about really embracing true interdisciplinarity. That kind of work is starting to happen now. There's lots of people who are working between the arts and the social sciences. There are artists who work with scientists as well. But what I want is for the conversation to be happening between social scientists and scientists. I think that was an important, it was very important in the 20th century to make a distinction between those two sciences and their ways of working. But I feel that that gap now and that lack of communication between the two is causing us to lose sight really of what science can contribute to society and also what society contributes to science. So for me, it's not just about breaking down the past, even though that's really important, acknowledging the things that happened in the past. It's about how we move on in the future and how we think about science and society. So I think for me, the big change will be if we ever get round, first of all, to learning about the history of science within a science curriculum, and also for scientists to consider where the history of their ideas come from. The trouble with race and racism is that race starts out as a scientific concept. It is now completely disavowed by the scientific community, quite rightly so. But the problem is, if we say that there is no biological basis for the idea of race, the implication becomes, well, then there's no such thing as racism. And then you have these two different groups of people not talking to each other. I feel like if the more that they start to do that and the more common ground that we can find between the two to be able to move forward in a way that is socially just, as a way that can encourage the change of the structures that exist now, then that's all for the better. I'm hoping that the work that I'm doing and the work that colleagues are doing to try to first of all, to look at the history of science, particularly at UCL, is starting to break down those barriers and to be able to understand. I think probably this is a long-term goal. So I will be proud if at the end of my career and my time at UCL, I've been here for a long time already, but I've got some goals. So if by the time I am leaving UCL, whenever that might be, if we are starting to see scientists or students studying what are called the hard sciences, so not just genetics, but things like chemistry and physics, the more they embrace the history of their own topics and understand where their ideas come from, we move away from the idea of science as ideology. Science is propping up positions of power. It's about really thinking about science as a toolkit and a technology. And I think scientists understand that, and us non-scientists can learn a lot from them, really about how they go about learning more about the natural world, and then we all benefit from that. So if by the time I leave, that kind of teaching is happening, I'll see that as a win. So for me, Bricks and Mortals is me taking a first step, but I'm not, as I've said, I'm not the first person to be doing this work at UCL. There are loads of people at the university who have included this subject, the history of eugenics, the history of race science. We teach it a lot, we do a lot of it. And for me, what's important is that it means that we're acknowledging our own past, we're being honest about it, and we're taking control of the narrative. There has been a lot of criticism of UCL from outside the university for things that have been happening here, which are considerably more negative than that. So it's about being positive, and it's about owning that history and moving forward together as a community within the university. The thing that I get back from a lot of my students is, thanks for being honest. We hadn't heard that story before. So I think that's the really important step, is that Bricks and Mortals is acknowledging that particular past. But it's only the first step. We need to reflect on that history, on how that history is still very much with us in our ways of thinking within the sciences. And that process of acknowledging and reflecting, that's how change happens. So it's a step, but I think it's hopefully a step in the right direction.